The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP at 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you are interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you are free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any of the content. If you like, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week, we are very pleased to present an interview with Mango and Marin, who are mental health care workers based in New York City. We are going to get into a lot of topics today, including anarchist critiques of psychiatry, ways that anarchists can be comrades with people who have survived the psych industry, and the Earth First Mad Camp, which our guests started. Shout out to Jayden for setting up this interview. Thank you so much. We had to cut a bunch out of the broadcast version of this interview, but check out the podcast up on our website and streaming on all the apps for much more information about how to access open dialogue style therapy and tips on how to start a mad camp. Also, you can check out our blog for a list of further reading materials recommended from our guests, again at our website.
Just a few quick announcements for this already robust episode of the Final Straw Radio. On Monday, October 1st at 8 a.m. sharp in Raleigh, there will be a protest of the North Carolina Department of Public Services, which oversees prisons in the state, demanding the release of prisoners from solitary confinement who are accused of participating in the 2018 nonviolent nationwide prison strike, and also as a reminder to people at the DPS that people on the outside are paying attention. The DPS can be found at 831 West Morgan Street in Raleigh. This jumps off a week of activity statewide in support of prisoners on the inside as a follow-up to the prison strike. If you want to participate and can't make that action, you could drop a banner, you could have a letter writing, you could have a phone zap, you could take an action, you could do any number of things. If you do, let us know here at The Final Straw, at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net, or send something to IGD. Let folks know. For folks in the Asheville area, there will be two events this week that BRABC, or Blue Ridge Anarchist Black Cross, will be putting on that you should consider taking part in. On Friday, October 5th, there will be a showing of the latest Trouble by Submedia, this time about hip-hop as resistance, from 6:30 to 8 p.m., and it'll be followed by a discussion at Firestorm Books and Coffee. 2 days later, also at Firestorm Books and Coffee, on Sunday, October 7th at 5 p.m., BRABC will be putting on a letter writing, its monthly letter writing for the first Sunday of the month, to reach out to political prisoners whose birthdays come up this month, as well as to prisoners in North Carolina facing repression for alleged participation in the prison strike. If you want to hear a great recent podcast on the repression since #PrisonStrike, check out the September 21st episode of Kiteline Radio. Kiteline is a weekly radio show that covers prisons from the inside and the out, and is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. We're also excited to announce the addition of Rebel Steps to CZN. Here's a jingle from them.
After the 2016 election, a lot of us woke up to some harsh realities. In the aftermath of dark events, I came back to political work with a new sense of urgency. But after a few months of showing up to protest every weekend, I started to burn out. It didn't feel like anything was changing. In fact, maybe things were even getting worse. And it got me thinking, what comes next? Rebel Steps is a podcast about what comes next. You'll hear episodes on letter writing to political prisoners, practicing mutual aid, and creating political art. You'll hear the voices and stories of my community in New York City, spotlighting a range of organizers from the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, NYC Books Through Bars, Anarchist Black Cross, Lower Manhattan Food Not Bombs, brand workers, and more. I'll walk you through what you can do to start plugging into movements and learning organizing skills step by step. If you've been to a march or two and you're looking to jump in, this podcast is for you. Or if you have friends looking for more, pass it on. Listen at rebelsteps.com, on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast.
Would you all mind introducing yourselves for the listeners and talking just a little bit about what you all do?
I'm Mango. I am a psychiatrist by profession, and I live here in New York, where I'm trying to find my place in this world of psychiatry, which is like inherently problematic. That's not something I knew going into it. Went to medical school with a pretty open mind, but yeah, every moment, I'm finding out more and more about this world that is just like really disquieting. And I'm originally from Canada, where our medical system is public, and I trained in medicine overseas, where there's like a private and public system combined. So coming to the U.S. was really like shocking, honestly. So I did my psychiatry training in Brooklyn, and just so many issues that just don't seem to matter as much elsewhere are just like on the forefront, like not even minor problems, but are major forces mixing themselves up with the so-called practice of, psychiatry and medicine. So, yeah, that's me. I don't know. I mean, I could go on.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about when you were talking about the problematic nature of psychiatry, perhaps in the U.S., that's like basically what we're here to talk about in this interview, and I'm sure we will get into it way more in subsequent questions. But did you have any thing that you wanted to add as part of your introduction about that specifically before we get into it?
Well, I could share a tidbit. So most recently, the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting, which is basically like a big festival for the pharmaceutical industry, was held in New York, and I joined the protest that was outside. It was a really lame protest that had to be sort of behind police barricades and some cars and stuff. But what was really interesting to me was sort of paying attention to who actually did come over and speak to the protesters. And so I had a sign up that was I'm a psychiatrist, ask me why I'm protesting, as a way to lure people into the conversation. And what came of that was that exclusively folks from overseas who would come to America, it might be their annual sort of psychiatry related conference or something. They're like, oh, it's in New York, I'm going to come. So all these people, psychiatrists and other people from Argentina or from Spain and from Egypt, they came over and they're like, hey, yeah, why are you protesting? And it was that was really striking to me, because they were just okay, I get it. Okay, you're protesting for this, you're protesting for that, you're protesting all these issues that, I'm opposed to and whatever. And they're like, oh, okay, well, that's not even an issue in our country. It was just, it's so embedded in the American milieu that it's almost unfelt. And for foreigners to come into this conference, they're just okay, what, sort of assuming that to some extent the system and the sort of the environment is similar to what they're familiar with, but it just isn't. They just don't have direct-to-consumer advertising for drugs. It doesn't exist, and they didn't think that it would exist. So that was news to, the foreigners and so on. And that, I mean, in a way, it was news to me too, because oh, wow, I don't have a TV or anything, but I'm informed, and it's obvious, that is a big part of why our system is the way it is and why people come to, medical professionals, so-called, with direct questions about drugs. Small thing, but it just didn't happen in Canada. That didn't happen. Like, it just doesn't happen elsewhere. That's not the first question that comes out of someone's mouth.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many thoughts that I have hearing you talk about that, but before, I wanted to give Marin a opportunity to introduce himself, if you'd like to.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Marin. I am from New York, and I've been living in Queens and Brooklyn for the last 6 years or something. Yeah, I got into the mental health field first as a patient, and that was, for much of my life, I was psychiatrized and diagnosed with a serious mental illness when I was 20, and I came into the field working as a peer specialist, which is someone who engages in a non-hierarchical kind of mutual support with other people who have presumably gone through similar struggles. So after I finished college, that was my first job, and I was also living in an anarchist collective at the time. I kind of came into that via the whole Occupy movement, and I saw a lot of crossover between the practice of peer support, this kind of mutual aid system almost, and anarchism, and just the values of anarchism and direct action and mutual support and things like that. So for me, it was a very intuitive way to sort of approach mental health. It's those of us who have been through similar experiences, who maybe share some version of history, even if it's just I have this diagnosis, you have that diagnosis, or whatever. We can support each other. And through that, I got involved with the Icarus Project, which is sort of known as a radical mental health movement that exists around the world, but mostly in the U.S. And so I was part of this peer support, peer specialist, formalized, professionalized thing for a while. And I worked at a crisis respite center, which is an alternative to hospitalization for people who are experiencing some kind of serious crisis. If they need a place to stay that's not at home, and if they need to get away and be around other people who kind of understand what they're going through from having first-hand experience. And then I met Mango when I was working on this open dialogue mobile treatment team, where a team of a peer, someone with lived experience like myself, and a clinician, so a psychiatrist or social worker or a psychologist, would go to visit people in their homes. And ideally, the idea was to kind of spare them the dehumanizing experience of treatment as usual. So to say to someone, hey, we don't use diagnoses. We don't necessarily believe that medications are going to solve all of the problems, but instead we're here to sort of facilitate a conversation between you and whoever else you deem important to you. So the aim of the program was to get people to sort of engage in these supportive conversations, and out of these conversations would come these amazing, amazing stories. It was almost exclusively family members that we worked with. And I mean, it was just so moving and so deep, and the relationships that we built with people just by visiting them in the home and facilitating these meetings that are called network meetings. That was an amazing experience, and it really was. A lot of the sort of principles that we were using really overlap a lot with even just consensus process facilitation or something like that, where everyone's voice matters, everyone's opinion matters. Our job as facilitators is to make sure that we're holding space for everyone, equally paying attention to the power dynamics in the room, and really trying to empower the family to be able to sort of create a holding environment for the person who might be in crisis, and to sort of take the isolation-inducing burden of being the individual diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, take that off of the individual and sort of try to create a holding environment for that person that's not just going to, blame them and isolate them. And so we did that. Mango and I did that together for for about 2.5 years. And then currently I'm in a clinical psychology doctoral program. So that's like kind of a weird place to be for me right now. But yeah, so I mean, I'm learning a lot about the field of psychology, which is also like psychiatry, like extremely problematic, has like a really oppressive history, and kind of comes from a place of, I don't know, just like it was clinical psychology itself was kind of born out of war and industrialization, and the ideas that sort of are the underpinning of the field are very much about sort of conformity and standardization and measurement and quantifying aspects of the human experience. And in the whole field has gone through like many revisions, in the 60s and then later on. And there are a lot of different sub-movements within it some of them are way more interesting and radical and humanistic than others. But so yeah, that's where I'm at now. Anyway, so that's the long and short of it.
No, that's...
Sorry if I went on too long.
No, not at all. That's super beautiful. I really connected with sort of the parallels between mutual aid and anarchism and this sort of like open dialogue. This open dialogue method of addressing mental wellness issues that you described. And what we're here to talk about, like I said before, is radical approaches to mental health. And since this is such a humongous topic, I thought maybe, and you sort of addressed it a little bit, Marin, but I'd love to hear about a little bit more about y'all's previous work and a little bit more about this method called Finnish open dialogue.
So yeah, the open dialogue approach, which originated in Finland, it actually like took a lot of ideas from the network therapy movement that happened in the U.S. in the 70s, I believe, which was kind of an outgrowth of family therapy. So I think like my sort of sketchy version of history is such that during like the 60s and the 70s, there was more of a push in the mental health field to focus on the family instead of the individual, and to sort of understand like the contextual nature of mental anguish and human suffering. And so there was more of a robust sort of family therapy movement during those years. And since then, since like the 60s and 70s, and since with like Reagan and neoliberalism, there was just a huge like focus, a return to the individual, that the individual is the one who has the problems. And then during that time, the DSM-3 came out, which really focused on the individual and focused on these, the creation of all these disorders. And, they created a whole bunch of new disorders and reclassified things. And it really did fit in with like a neoliberal model, which said, here's the standard way of being in the world. And if you don't, like the only way that we as a government or as institutions are going to help people is if there's some way to psychiatrically diagnose them as having some kind of problem. So we saw like throughout history this kind of return to like the individual pathology. And then in the 80s in Europe, I guess they were thinking like a little bit more openly about these things. And they sort of revived this like network approach, where instead of like having an individual who gets diagnosed with a mental disorder and then receives like individualized treatment and psychopharmacology, they said like, let's look at the environment that people are in, and let's try to change the conversations that people are having, and let's work with their families, and let's work with their friends, and let's like try to build more of like a strong community to address some of the issues that are present in individuals, or that appear to be present in individuals. So it really did sort of, I think the community approach, the network approach, the idea that one person who's having a crisis is not just a broken brain. They're a human being, and what they're experiencing is very much connected to everyone who's around them, very much connected to time and place and history, and really just like connected to everything, connected to the institutions that they're surrounded by, just to culture. And I think the reason why they had such good outcomes when they developed this model in Finland, for one, they were doing it in a relatively homogeneous environment. So they didn't have the diversity that we have here, like working in New York at all. So understandings of like, I don't know, I think it was easier for them to sort of take a community and cultural approach to these things because they're working in Finland and like, you know, people speak the same language. And so you can have like an approach that sort of embodies like a more sociocultural, contextual way of looking at things. And it's a lot harder here in the US, but I think we had a lot of success with it. And one of the things that we learned from some of the research that was done on our program was that people felt really empowered, and they really did there was like a noticeable sense of agency, that instead of being treated by these paternalistic institutions that kind of like treat you like a baby and really like limit your freedom in really, really horrible ways and really traumatizing ways, people felt really empowered. And that was one of their main responses when research was done on the work that we did, was like, you know, they didn't feel like we were trying to make decisions for them. They felt like they had the power to make decisions themselves, and they felt heard, and they felt like their stories were heard and they were honored and valued. And that to me that's healing. That to me is so much more powerful. That's such a more powerful form of healing than just saying, hey, like, you're bipolar, you're schizophrenic, here are the meds, go to therapy. It was definitely like a moving experience for me to have.
It sounds incredibly moving. Yeah. Mango, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, of course, it was really like the most amazing experience, and we were so lucky to sort of have the time and to some extent the support to be able to hear stories that would never be heard. And so what Marin was saying about sort of decentralizing the like locus of the problem from the person, from the individual, like in so doing, like with working in the family setting, not only could sort of lift that person out of their pigeonhole, their diagnosis or whatnot, could also hear from the family members and the network members whose stories are also not heard and whose experiences would never be of interest to anybody, but were so valuable in sort of like spreading the growth around in a way, outward and outward and outward. And you can get history from people, and you can get a sense of like ancestry, and you can get immigration stories. And yeah, I mean, we worked in Queens. So it was like basically the most diverse place on Earth. And as Marin was saying about Finland, it's not just Finland that this model has been adapted in. It's a particular part of Finland which is really remote. It's actually like north of the Arctic Circle, where I think it's 99% of people there speak the same dialect of Finnish. So the model has been really amazing there. And what happened when they applied it to the U.S., I think some sort of European administrators and psychiatrists in the city here sort of like got wind of this open dialogue method and were like, okay, let's apply it. But what they did, and this is why I ended up working with Marin, is that they not only brought the method over, but they added peers, like the peer specialists, onto our teams. And that's not something that is part of the system, that I don't believe it is in Finland. So it was this challenge and this, great asset to have, in a way, like a representative of the most deeply affected person in that network there on the so-called like treatment side of the team. And you could model, or like we were able to model how we would like, people to be treated differently. So, I could, as the representative of the top of the hierarchy, for sure, as a psychiatrist, it's like basically I'm a parent, I'm a government, I'm the top here in the system. Yeah, I could use that power. And this is sort of how we ended up working, is I would use my authority to offer space and time and authority to Marin or to the other peer specialist that was there. And so then we would be able to model that kind of interaction for the families that had been so molded by the system at large to that point. I mean, some of our best work, of course, was done with the people who somehow we were able to but we were able to start working with them very early in their psychiatrization process. I think that was actually the point of the program. It was hard to achieve this, but the idea was to really catch people at a first episode. And that's definitely what they've been doing in Finland. Even what they would say prodromal kind of symptoms or whatever sort of trigger a referral to one of these teams in Finland. And that was the idea here, although the system is so discombobulated that was rarely possible. But I do think that when it was possible, those were really, really great network meetings and just a great experience because people hadn't been dragged so deeply into this gross system to that point.
In preparing for this interview, I watched a YouTube documentary from this ex-psychiatrist named Daniel Mackler about this process. And he is, extremely angry at psychiatry and psychology in the U.S. and for some pretty solid reasons, having humongously long working history under this system. But what really impressed me was this two things, which were an emphasis on decentralization and non-hierarchical communication between therapists and people seeking treatment, and also this statement that they made somewhat at the beginning of the documentary about the cultural or social construct of psychosis and how it differs between Western Lapland and the U.S.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about the cultural construct of mental wellness issues, or what was in the documentary called psychosis, between the two models of care.
I mean, that's such a huge question. It's such a huge topic. I mean, for one thing, all of the categories that we use and the metaphors that we use to understand so-called mental illness or so-called psychosis are so culturally bound, and the way that we understand it typically in the U.S. is via the DSM. But yeah, all of these disorders listed in the DSM are totally just for the most part, pretty arbitrarily created by literally a council, a small council of psychiatrists who vote on the validity of any given diagnosis. So, talk about socially constructed, literally people they're in a room talking to each other and thinking about should we create a new diagnosis? Let's create oppositional defiant disorder. Let's create, really one of the sort of founding anti-psychiatry psychiatrists, Thomas Saz, I think he put it really well that, these are not actual diseases by any stretch at all. These are just problems that people have with living, with existing, with relating to one another. So yeah, he used the word problems with living. But yeah, all the ways that we understand mental difference and human suffering, it is completely against, in the US, it's against a very homogenized sort of white, Western, usually upper middle class male standard. So basically how we define mental health or mental illness or anything like that is ultimately a very subjective thing. So when we talk about specific, disorders or whatever, we're not talking about organic neurological illnesses at all. It's not like dementia where you can see a brain scan and you can actually understand what's going on in the person's brain. These are socially constructed things. And then psychosis is also there's really no way to objectively draw the line between what is psychosis and what's, quote, normal. That line doesn't exist. It is a subjective line. It's a fluid line. when we talk about like reality, for example, or like, you know, like someone losing touch with reality, like how we define reality, you know, we define it by consensus. There is kind of like a tacit understanding of what is real and what isn't. And all of it is just so fluid. And there's a great document that the British Psychological Society put out on understanding psychosis, where they say it very clearly, like there is no way to determine clearly and objectively like what is psychotic and what isn't. But I guess in the US, you know, like it's sort of known, you know, like if someone's hearing voices, they're psychotic. If someone's having visions, that's psychosis. If people are thinking and speaking in a way that is perhaps like really difficult to follow for sort of like neurotypical people, like that's psychosis. And for one thing, when you pathologize things like hearing voices, which is actually very common, you end up really harming a lot of people, because there are plenty of people who hear voices and it's not distressing. There are also people who hear voices and it is distressing. So really, all these definitions are socially constructed and they're all really fluid. And it's, yeah, I don't know. One person on the internet recently said something like, psychosis is just like something that they label you with when they don't like how you're behaving. And that's like, this is from a guy with lived experience who like has been hospitalized and psychiatrized, and that's how he interprets it, as like a negative judgment, as like a thinly veiled sort of moral judgment about his behavior. So yeah, I mean, it's a really problematic field. And I think when we take away the DSM and when we really just try to understand like what people are actually trying to say, you know, in these moments of crisis and moments of distress, when the act of speech can be so difficult to do, you know, speaking can be so incredibly difficult, and understanding and listening can be so difficult when things are so emotionally charged. But when you're able to sort of slow things down in the way that we were able to in these network meetings, and really try to actually understand what people were saying and what they were communicating, without resorting to sort of problem solving, without resorting to labeling, I think that's when we had the most success, and people actually grew from these experiences rather than feeling that they were broken from them.
Yeah. I've just been thinking, because your prompt was kind of getting at maybe the possible differences between here and in Finland, and this is by no means scientific, but I have been thinking that the proximity of Lapland is the ancestral homeland of the Sami people. So I've been thinking, okay, I don't know, how is it that this open dialogue model just fit so nicely into this particular part of the world where, you know, there's a pretty, I don't know, I believe a pretty felt influence of the First Nations, indigenous people of that area. And it's just something that I've always been interested in, the reasons why psychosis, so-called, like, continues to exist in our world in sort of like high numbers. So what is that? You know, what might be the positive or important or evolutionarily beneficial reasons for that to exist? And so when you explore any kind of Aboriginal understanding and history of this kind of thing, of course, you get like a shamanistic type interpretation, which is, oh yes, of course, you know, we need difference, you know, we need special, we need magic, we need that. It brings us forward, it protects us, it moves us. And, you know, of course, interestingly, the numbers suggest that there's maybe like a 1 to 2% of the population, I guess, would be diagnosed schizophrenic, but whatever that means, like psychosis, other wonderful, fabulous experiences or scary experiences. But what is that percent? Like, that's so interesting. It sort of creates a little pockets of 100, 200 people at a time, which very well would have historically been about the size of a typical tribe that would have one, like really cool, fabulous leader. And, as the tribe grows, maybe someone creates an offshoot and everyone can follow them. And that's this kind of like vague shamanistic interpretation of psychosis and why it continues to prevail in the evolutionary sense. And of course, like we wish, and in working with people, are like, what can we do to make our world today find appreciation in all of the shamans amongst us? Like how, what? And maybe it is sitting and having the time to listen to stories and really to process with people.
No, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Because, like, as both of y'all were talking about this, and since this interview started, and because I am, like, kind of a one-trick pony when it comes to analyzing difficulties or oppressions, I've just been thinking about how, at least in the U.S., since I have very little experience with other countries, how in the U.S. both capitalism and settler colonialism seem to rely so much on having an other and having many others, really, and in having sort of this toxic individualism, and which the flip side of that, of course, is chronic isolation. And seemingly, like, yeah, I'm not entirely sure where to go with that, but like in this documentary, they definitely mentioned that as well.
I mean, the world that we live in, like living in capitalism, like living in just like patriarchy, like all these things are a recipe for breakdown for many people. I mean, it's like you can look at mental issues one way, which is like, this sort of the prevailing neurobiological way, or you can really try to understand the context that people are living in and the intersections of oppression that people are encountering. And that's something that like is, I think, I get the sense that it's becoming more understood or more like widespread in like training institutions, like to think about oppression and to think about the sort of social production of suffering. But we still live in a world that is so reductionistic and really like wants to ignore the oppressive context that we live in and really just sort of in effect maintain that. So in a lot of ways, I think the mental health system as it stands now, in which like people of color and like First Nation people are like treated absolutely horrendously by the mental health system, like rather than actually changing anything about society, like the sort of neurobiological way of looking at mental suffering is in effect just supporting the status quo. To me, that's a huge problem, and that's sort of like, that's always been my struggle in psychology is like, at what point do you stop looking at the individual and do you start looking at the social context that people exist in and how we relate to it and what forces are driving us apart. And I think, like in New York and just in the work that Mango and I did, I think, we find that like loneliness is really one of the biggest factors in what creates sort of a chronic mental suffering or emotional suffering for people. And in so many ways, the mental health system really creates like loneliness and isolation by othering people, by labeling them with psychotic disorders and really making the general public kind of afraid of these people who have so much to offer in terms of like because really, I mean, what are people who are experiencing what people are doing when they're experiencing psychosis, I believe, is channeling a lot of the sort of split off, not talked about, not understood, shameful or oppressive, or just, things that are unprocessed by society at large end up getting kind of dumped on individuals. And in a way, they become sort of a mouthpiece for just like the suffering of the world and the burdens of society. And it's really like to me, it's really amazing. And some of the people that we worked with, I just wanted so badly for them to have some kind of platform or like to have some kind of to be heard and to be understood and to not be just written off as, quote, crazy, or to be further oppressed for having gone through what they're going through.
Certainly. And also, sometimes I feel like the elephant in the room when conversations about mental health are like brought to the table is medication. And Mango, you had some words at the beginning about like your stance on medication and stuff like that. I was wondering if you felt comfortable going a little bit more into your observations and your experiences and about how medication is used or misused.
Sure. I think it connects a lot to what Marin was saying and what you had asked, and wondered about that isolation and that individualization of the suffering of the universe. So a lot of the practice of this sort of open dialogue team, or at least I know Marin and I worked a lot on this, was just talking frankly about those kinds of issues with people and bringing the medication piece into it and using it as an example of how that's being applied. How is it that on one hand, maybe the family can acknowledge that some of the struggles happened at the point of immigration to this country, or when someone experienced some like unspoken of trauma, something at school, some, bullying, chronic this, chronic that. So how is it that is known and that can be explored in depth, and sort of everyone gets that, but yet the response was, by previous professionals, so-called professionals, was to sort of medicate that away, to offer some pill, some cure, something. So I was pretty frank about that kind of thing, with all of the caveats that have to come along with it, which is, okay, we can understand, maybe we can come to a point where we're truly informed about the risks of the medications, not only to your body and to your brain, but to what it sort of does to you as a person in society. So you're a medicated person. People can see that. You're other. Do you have to go, if you're young and you're at school, you have to stop at the nurse's office. Like, people know this about you. Certain of the drugs require you to take to provide blood work, or you get an injection or whatnot. So there's that. And then there's, of course, stigma is kind of a general term, but like the stigma of being that, going to just being known, in being the member of someone's family that everyone's like circling around or avoiding or whatever. So those are effects of medicating people, like above and beyond the physical effects. Yeah. So we had to have those conversations, but with all of the warnings that, hey, if you stop this all of a sudden, it could be really bad for you, or let's make sure that it's in like a safe formulation so that you can start tapering it. And what do you expect? What will all of us expect? What could we expect? What has happened in the past when you tried to stop this stuff? And how can we find something more fulfilling and more meaningful to sort of put in its place, at least temporarily and hopefully for the long term? So there's a lot of that. I mean, the issue is, or my problem, the issue for me was that our program was really wonderful, and it was personal, and it was held in people's homes, or we met people in cafes or whatever. But as soon as family or the person had to re-engage with the system at large, that all of the weight of the medical model sort of came crashing down. And, in retrospect, I feel like if we had time, we should have done even more sort of preparatory work around that. Like, okay, so you're gonna reduce the meds, something or other, which is probably an effect of the withdrawal from those meds will or may come up. How is the world going to react to that? what will happen if we're not there at that moment? You'll probably have to reach out to the system, I don't know, 911, whatever. What will happen then? What are the consequences of that? Can we avoid that, etc.?
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, so some of the benefits of working in this way in Lapland is that it's the whole system was transformed.
Yeah, they in Western Lapland, they had amazing results of just like a lot of people, getting back into the swing of things after a first episode, and moving on with their lives without using medication at all. And you were using very minimal amounts of medication. I think the way that the team that we worked on used meds was like only like very, very sparingly, like if that's what was necessary to like maybe get someone to sit down and have these meetings, like to really just to the point where they were able to sort of have a conversation. But even sometimes that didn't work, or it was refused. And one of the things that I think we did really well was create an empowering environment where people could say, no, I don't want that. I don't want to be on meds. And that was okay. And we worked with that. And it was really about informed consent and individual choice and people having the sense of agency and empowerment to make these decisions for themselves. Because a lot of the people, they had some experience using meds or being on meds, and that was, for the most part, pretty negative. And, there was some people who wanted to be off of them completely. And I think Mango was amazing at helping people get off of the meds that they were put on after a first episode, if that's what they wanted. And then there were some people who found medication useful and wanted to continue taking it. And I think really, like, for myself, it's just a matter of, informed consent and personal choice. And I'm not like, I personally like don't take any medications. It took me 3.5 years, but I was able to get off of everything that I was put on when I was 20 years old and I had a first break. And that was an incredibly difficult process for me. And I think I'm living like a better life now that I'm not on the meds, but it's so hard to know. And I think people in like the general public, or definitely people in the mental health field, they listen with a very black and white mentality, like, oh, these people are anti-meds, like, that's wacky or whatever, or these people are like pro-meds. And it's just, I don't know. I think it's more complicated than that. And I personally like don't find it helpful to like judge other people for taking anything, like using whatever substance, works for them. And like, as long as it's working for them, whether that's like a glass of wine or like, like other like illicit drugs or prescription drugs. Like, to me, drugs are drugs. And there's always been a role for drugs of some kind in alleviating human suffering. So like, we just need to grapple with that and be smart about it, I think, and use substances in a way that's more, I don't know, like healthier for us, perhaps.
Yeah, I connected with that. I mean, it seems to me that these things are tools, and where things generally, at least in my experience, become problematic is when they get applied across the board without any sort of analysis or case-by-case discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps, like, meds are such a touchy subject, but maybe this is somewhat similar.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the field of psychiatry. I would love to hear y'all's opinions as two people who seem to have a lot of roots in the far left and maybe anarchism on rad or anarchist approaches to mental health in the U.S. What goes right in your opinion, and what sort of do anarchists or folks on the far left have to work on as far as their approaches to mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are definitely like certain places and people and groups on the left that are thinking about mental health from a more radical point of view. There's the Icarus Project, and that's kind of like, I think that's known to be sort of like the lefty sort of radical mental health approach that really does interrogate systems of oppression when thinking about mental health. But I don't know. I think like problems on the left are, it's still very much like a productionistic kind of mentality, like as activists, people work themselves to the point of burnout, and that's seen as like, it's sort of glorified. And I'm noticing like some change in that regard. People are not so wrapped up in like burning themselves out on activism, maybe. But, I think in order for the movements to be like inclusive, we have to think about just like what psychological or emotional, like mental issues we're coming to the movement with, and to make space for people with differences in that regard. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we were going for with Mad Camp, within the Earth First movement, was like trying to like carve out a space within Earth First that would be just like supportive, to people who are coming to the movement with lots of like trauma, or with like, just any kind of mental health issues. And also to like recognize that people diagnosed with mental illnesses are in some ways are like an oppressed class within the world that we live in. So that was like the idea there. I mean, I don't know so much about like some of the other radical mental health stuff that's going on, but I think like anytime people are getting together to think about these things and like form mutual support groups, or try to sort of like take back the power that's been usurped by the mainstream mental health system, I think that's like amazing and radical and should happen way more, and can definitely happen way more. I mean, I would love to see more of a connection between the sort of like psychiatric survivor movement and like the radical left. For the most part, the psychiatric survivor movement is like, I think some of the people who are involved in that are definitely on the left and consider themselves anarchists, but I don't know, it's not really like known within anarchist circles so much that there is like an amazing history of protest and a history of movement building that goes back to the 60s and the 70s, where people who have been seriously harmed by psychiatry have fought back in like pretty awesome ways.
That is really compelling. Is there a further resource that you would recommend to people who want to learn more about that?
Yeah, I think one, actually like relatively recently, just like on the internet, I came across some people who are in the sort of mad studies world, like within academia. So like within the critical disabilities world in academia, there's like a subset of that called mad studies. And folks in mad studies are doing some awesome scholarly work and activism around issues of madness. And it's like something like the Belly Research Institute.
Yeah, that's right. It was BELLI.
Yeah, BELLI Research Institute. It's very cool, and I think that's one potential resource. But I don't know what else is out there. I think like,
Mad in America. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mad in America for sure. Yeah, Mad in America is like the website of one of like the leaders of the sort of in like the world of critical psychiatry, Robert Whitaker. Robert Whitaker came out with these two books a while back, Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic, where he exposed the sort of just like corruption that's in the mental health system and in the pharmaceutical corporate world. That website it contains a lot of good sort of left-leaning critique, but it's not explicitly like political or like anarchistic in any way at all. But I think it could be. I think that there is a lot of potential. I mean, I see like one of the things that I would like to do is build more of a bridge between the prison abolition movement and the psychiatric survivor movement, because in my mind, like mental hospitals where you can be locked away without a sentence, where like your freedom is completely conditioned on like the opinion of some psychiatrist, that's like outrageous to me. And like I think the sort of the prison abolition movement maybe can, I don't know, maybe people who are like thinking about alternatives to psychiatric incarceration can learn from the prison abolition movement. But I would definitely love to see more of like more of an integration of of these movements.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I've ever heard it articulated quite in that way, so thank you so much for that. Mango, did you have anything that you wanted to add as far as like critiques or good points of like rad approaches to mental health?
I'm in the same boat as Marin. I don't know too much outside of what we did, which I felt was like pretty rad. But what I would say is the radical type approach is really palatable to pretty much everyone. And it's probably more palatable if you're not as explicit about it. But the experience of working on this mobile team definitely proved that to be the case. Like this approach pretty much worked for everybody. When you apply small bits of that in sort of the privacy of a therapy office or, you know, or in like a psychiatry visit that from the outside looks pretty typical. I mean, I just wish it was not like such a big statement actually to be human about things and to treat people with dignity and to acknowledge their words as true and their experiences as true and to be real about consent in the system and just honest about stuff and not to keep secrets. And the psychiatric system is so deep. As Marin was saying, it's basically a representation, some representation of a prison, whether it's inpatient, outpatient, whether you're like, you know, sort of control, your body is controlled and limited by drugs, psychiatric drugs, or whether your body is limited because you're literally locked up. I mean, all of it. So it's everywhere. And maybe the radical thing to do is to, you know, address it at every possible opportunity that you can. We didn't choose the clientele of our team. You know, they by no means would have had access to or ran into anything like the Icarus Project, which is unfortunate, but that's the reality. And nonetheless, we are able to basically apply all those same principles anyway.
Thank you for going into that. And I am very compelled by the link between prison abolition and the, psychiatric survivor, psychiatric industrial complex survivor movement. That's definitely something that's super thought-provoking and very compelling, I think. I would love to talk a little bit more about Mad Camp, which y'all mentioned, but before we go into that, this open dialogue method of treatment, we've been talking about it in relationship to Western Lapland, which is, of course, very far away from here. And you did mention that there are sort of places around the world where this method is practiced and is accessible to people. If there is a listener who is interested in learning more about where they can access something like that, where would you point them to?
Oh man, that's the heartbreaking reality is it's just not accessible. It really isn't. And there's some places in Massachusetts that practice open dialogue where you can access an open dialogue team to come to your home and conduct network meetings and do kind of what we were doing. The agency that does that is called Advocates, and they're in Framingham, Massachusetts. In Vermont, there's some of this. The Howard Center, which is a big social service agency in Burlington, Vermont, some folks there are practicing open dialogue. And then there are some places elsewhere in the country, maybe something in Georgia, but it's not accessible. Even our program wasn't really accessible to the public. Our referrals came from a very limited number of people and places. And the reason for that was pretty sad and kind of sinister almost. The agency that we worked for purposely didn't want to even create a website for our program because they thought that we would just get so many referrals that we would be like totally swamped. And they also just didn't really support it because it is kind of a radical paradigm shifting approach. But, you know, I think like, yeah, so it is really upsetting to me actually that like these kinds of approaches like haven't really taken off. But I think what can be done sort of in lieu of like actual formal open dialogue treatment is like finding like good family therapy. You know, family therapy, like that exists way more than open dialogue, and, you know, in like all kinds of, you know, all corners of the country. And like, I think if instead of like treating a crisis as like one individual's problem, but instead like if you were thinking as a family or as a social network or as like a group about just like what the group can do to sort of like really listen to that person and like know how to support them better, and then also like, and vice versa, you know, like just all around like better communication, then maybe family therapy could be like a substitute for what we did, because I think a lot of what we did was very much derived from family therapy.
Well, you could go to the UK, England, yeah, and other Scandinavian countries sort of applying this. But there are sort of other, I mean, the other big similar sort of non-pathologizing type, it's not even treatment, but community is the Hearing Voices Network, which is worldwide, also really big in the UK and sort of starting up a little more powerfully in, I don't know, in North America. So, yeah, I mean, people can look into that a little bit more, but in a way, it's sort of like support groups for people who have interesting, unique, special experiences. One of the groups in New York is called Complex Minds Group, and that sort of brings it all together. Where you know, of course, people can meet like-minded folks, non-pathologizing, totally exploratory, and safe.
That's awesome. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad that there's something, at least for people who are interested or compelled by this kind of therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also just, I know like stuff exists and I'm just not aware of it, you know, like I know for sure that like there's awesome mental health radical like things that are, you know, more, even like way more grassroots and like not quite on my radar, but like perhaps like people who are listening might know of stuff and could like comment or whatever if they know of things.
Did y'all have more to add on this topic?
No, I don't know. Do you want to talk about Mad Camp? Because I'm like super excited about that.
Yeah, talk about Mad Camp.
I would love to hear more about Mad Camp and how it started and what was the thinking behind it and your experiences and anything you care to mention.
Yeah, I think it was 2013. I was at an Earth First Rondi, and there was just like a conversation about oppression, and at no point like had I ever really heard anyone talking about mad people as an oppressed group in the US. So I was like, hey, like, let's have that conversation too and bring that in, because like, you know, we're talking about ways to make this movement more accessible and more inclusive. Let's include more mad folks, you know? And it came out of a conversation with someone else, with this person, Nettle, who's totally awesome. And just like out of the woodwork, like very organically, maybe like 25 people just showed up for the first Mad Camp meeting, and it was under a tarp in the rain, and it was just so moving and so beautiful. And, you know, like to have a space where, because so many people come into the movement, you know, carrying a lot of trauma, carrying like a lot of pain and like a lot of just interpersonal issues. And so, yeah, it really just kind of took off in a very organic way. And sort of like by consensus, we all decided like we want Mad Camp to be its own thing at Earth First. You know, like we'll have our own sort of camping area, and we can have meetings every day where we like process things together and talk about just like our strategies for, not just like our strategies for making the movement more inclusive, but also just what we do to keep our spirits high when we're not in the space. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like it was just such a, there was definitely a need for it, and it kind of took off organically out of that. But yeah, I mean, it's just like the power of peer support, you know, like people getting together in a non-hierarchical way to like share information and share knowledge and just like provide love and support for each other. And I think that's the most beautiful way to cope with just the fucked up shit in the world.
Certainly. And what is Mad Camp a thing that still happens at Earth First Rondies, or is it something that's grown beyond the Rondies?
I think we want it to grow beyond the Rondies, and ever since it started, we've been talking about the possibility of like just having a Mad Camp weekend or rendezvous for maybe 4 days or something in the woods, but that hasn't happened yet. But I think it will at some point in the near future. But yeah, it's been a presence at every Earth First Rondi since 2013. And I took a break from going to Rondies for a little while, and I went back for the first time, and I was just blown away by how much Mad Camp had grown and like just like what people were doing, and it was like a really powerful experience for me.
That's so cool to hear.
I hope people are inspired to sort of go home and like develop their own kind of networks of mutual support and solidarity around issues of madness and mental difference and all of that, because like that to me that's what changed my life. Like I was like diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 20, and for me, like I had never met other people who had similar experiences to me until I entered this peer support world, and that was just the most incredible thing. And like I'd say, I don't identify with this like diagnosis anymore at all, and like I don't take any meds anymore, and I just really like have kind of rejected that kind of way of understanding myself completely. But like I still very much identify with others who have gone through that, who are going through that, and I still feel like it's so important for me to be connected to others who are like experiencing that kind of just that sense of otherness and isolation that comes with experiencing so-called psychiatric distress or whatever.
Certainly, especially given the culture of silence that we still operate under, even in certain far left or anarchist milieus around this topic.
Yeah, definitely.
And it seems to me just like the carving out of intentional space for this is key to starting something like Mad Camp. Would you say that there are other things involved for any listeners who are like wanting to replicate something like that where they're at, but who might not go to their Earth First Rondies?
Sure, yeah. One of the things that we used at Mad Camp at one point was the Icarus Project zine, Friends Make the Best Medicine, which it's a great zine. It's kind of old now, but it has a lot of good tips for starting your own sort of support groups or your own Icarus Project chapter, if that's what you want to do. And yeah, I think one of the most important points I think is to be inclusive and like not shaming anyone if they do take medication or if they don't take medication, like being non-judgmental around that issue, because that can lead to just like such fragmentation. It's like really absurd. Or like, identifying with a diagnosis. Like we welcome people who don't identify with any diagnosis at all. And we also welcome people who do. It's just a matter of like what language you use to understand yourself and like what metaphors are valid for you. And so, yeah, not getting too caught up in sort of like the politics around meds or diagnosis, I think is important for anyone who's starting something, because everyone's at a different stage, like in this process of like understanding themselves and understanding the world. And even to say like a stage is almost too linear of a way to think about it. Like, like there are infinite ways of understanding mental difference and mental health and whatever. And it's really like, to me, like to build a movement around it, you really need to value like all the different ways that people are experiencing things and how they make sense of it, and empower people to sort of use their own language, whatever language they're comfortable with, to sort of communicate what they're going through.
Yeah, that also seems super crucial to me. Mango, did you have anything you wanted to add about Mad Camp?
I'm just a lowly participant. Was not involved was not involved in the creation of Mad Camp at all. But to your question about how do you apply sort of Mad Campy stuff to your community and to your life, I mean, Marin did that even in our sort of treatment program with something as simple as offering a picnic for everyone to sort of gather in a public place, like just in a public place, but a together place. And it just made, what did it do? De-individualized the thing. It reduced the shame for the families and the networks, and it was just fun. And people were able to just chit-chat, and all they had in common really was that they knew, Marin or me or someone else on our team. And it was just a really interesting experience because we were like, oh, hey, are you a participant? Hey, are you a psychiatrist? Like, there was just no way to know because there's no way to know. And yeah, that was just a really magical component of our stuff, and just speaks to the point that you can really do this anywhere as long as you're open. It's like safe and nice, and if it's around the time of like a meal, that there's food.
What are y'all working on right now?
I'm like in a weird world of like, in my first year of a PhD program, and like, so I do feel very like distant from the movement right now, which sucks, but hopefully whatever I'm learning, I can apply it and like, sort of like bring it back to my community. But yeah, I mean, that's about it for me, is like academic, stuff. I mean, that's not true. I guess like, well, I'm doing some other things. Like there's going to be a conference in October. It's a conference called the Association for the Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society, which is at Rutgers in New Jersey. And the theme of that conference is, I don't know, it has some like leftist kind of theme to it. And it's a cool conference from what I've heard. And I'll be talking about sort of like alternatives to psychiatric incarceration, and trying to like inspire other people to start thinking about like bridging the gap between the prison abolition movement and the anti-psychiatry movement, and like thinking critically about just like what it means to live in a society where we deal with our problems by locking people up, and to think about like what we can, because in a lot of ways, like there's a lot of overlap between what people are doing in like restorative or transformative justice and open dialogue even. Like those two models kind of are very similar to each other. So I think, like to sort of move people back in the direction of like perhaps like healing justice and accountability. And I don't know, that's one thing I'll be doing. That's like probably the only kind of cool thing I'll be doing in the next like month or two.
Can people who are in New Jersey, is that an open conference? Can people go to that?
I think if you're like if you're just like coming from the community, I think it might be like a reduced fee, or maybe it's free. I don't know. I have to look into it, but it's the Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society, and like that's what it's called, and it's in October. So yeah, I would look into it.
Marin, you and I and some other people are also going to be at another conference.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be talking about our experiences working in this sort of open dialogue type team. That's in November. It's in Philadelphia, and it is going to be part of my favorite conference, or one of so far of my life. It's the International Society for the Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. That's ISPS, and it's the American branch, the U.S. branch meeting, sometime in November.
Oh,
so
man, it would be so cool to get.
Then.
Yeah, but to get more anarchists like to come to these kinds of conferences, because ISPS is really cool, and there's a lot of good stuff that that I think is very relevant to like the left, and there's like a lot of stuff happening on the left that's like relevant to this world. So yeah, I mean, like the coolest thing ever to me would be for having like a bunch of anarchists come show up at ISPS or at the Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society conference, and that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, the interesting thing about some of those conferences, I think, is that often you do get international people, and I don't know, like the Italians are doing such great stuff because they deinstitutionalize their entire country. They don't have inpatient, like forced hospitalization anymore. So yeah, it's just like a nice ingathering of folks, and we can get out of our bubble a little bit. And then, things like that open dialogue team come out of that because we hear about what's going on in the rest of the universe. I mean, stateside, it's like a little more hush-hush, but we're trying to do some stuff with respect to the American Psychiatric Association meeting. The next one's going to be in San Francisco. That location for the APA was where the LGBT, at the time it was gay activists, got like homosexuality written out of the DSM. So it's this like nice historical moment. I think it's been about 40 years. I don't know, 40 or 50 years. So, we're going to try to get some stuff going there. And I think there's a little bit more talk in general, just psychiatrists coming out of the woodwork, acknowledging their discomfort with the system, and basically just, as inspired by Mad Camp and stuff like that, and just Anarchy Land, mutual support for all of us who are like out there really being exposed to the backlash and to the, like, oftentimes like threats from the system when we push back. So yeah, I don't know. I have an online group called Psychiatrists Anonymous that anyone can join who's a psychiatrist. But that's on my end.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that's super important is like building up support for like psychiatrists and mental health professionals who are critiquing the system and who are like trying to build alternatives or trying to transform the system from within or whatever they're doing. Like, the backlash, especially psychiatrists receive, is like really intense. And I think what Mango has received just is totally horrible and crushing. And it's like really tough to be a psychiatrist who like questions the utility of the DSM, who like questions the validity of like just like diagnostic classifications, and someone who's like critical of the medications that get used. And so like I think building up more support networks for psychiatrists who want to practice in a different way, in a more humanistic way, is like super important.
Agreed. I'm so sorry that you have received some bullshit, Mango. That's really terrible to hear. But it is really interesting to see, just from a layperson's perspective, how the ways in which the psychiatric sort of sphere is changing, given like generations and generations of super fucked up stuff happening and people backlashing against it now, is really inspiring.
Yeah.
Those are all the questions that I had. Is there anything that y'all would like to add as part of this interview?
I'd like to thank you so much. I think it's very, just my experience has been a lot of like, oh, shut up. Like, what are you talking about? You're crazy just like them, kind of like using the C word. And it's just it's very healing for me, and I don't know, just motivating to be heard, to have a place where I could be heard and where people can hear and learn from Marin, and thank you.
Definitely. This has been a really, really wonderful interview for me to be a part of, and this conversation, I think, is not over. You know, there were so many moments in this conversation where I was like, this could be a book, or this could be its own interview. And I want to sort of like invite either of y'all to come onto the show at any time. I would love to do an interview with y'all about the talk that Marin, you said you were going to give at the conference about alternatives to psychiatric incarceration. I think that sounds like not only really interesting, but also crucially relevant to sort of intersectional anarchism. So, you know, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the show. It's been really lovely just hearing your words and hearing your experiences, and very, very thought-provoking.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank you too. Like, thank you so much for having us on the show. And I definitely, like, ever since I kind of like went into just like PhD land, like I've been kind of cut off from things that have been happening. So like, I don't want to make it seem like there isn't like a movement of like radical mental health stuff going on like all over the place, because I'm sure that there is. I just don't know of it. And like, yeah, so that's something that like is that's just like a limitation of my own knowledge.
I hear a lot. So I'm in my mid-30s, so a lot of the peers that I had or still have in anarchism and like in the radical, you know, far left stuff are in school or, you know, trying to learn a thing, and many of those people are in healthcare. There are a shit ton of anarchists in healthcare, which is really wonderful, and a lot of people are seeking like social work and therapy degrees and stuff. So I hear a lot of the like academic isolation, because it's a lot of work doing that stuff. So props to you, and like props to anyone who's doing it, and taking a really, really huge one for the team too in this work as well.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for listening. This is William with the Final Straw Radio. You can check out our blog for a list of further reading, and if you have any suggestions for further interview topics from these guests or any others, you can email us at tfsradioshow@protonmail.com.
The musical tracks that you hear featured on this episode were found on a 2003 Cancun Anti-World Trade Organization protest mixtape. At the start of the episode, it was Casey Neal with Hooray for the Riff Raff, and closing us out is Weird Sisters with A Farewell to Claycout. As with every episode, the playlist can be found linked in our show notes.
Take a deep breath and blow the bridge down. Upwards of thousands have stood in the way, but police just come and take them each day. And the government too has its own saws. They're changing the charges by changing the law. So blow the bridge down in the dead of the night. Sink it into the ground for the sake of the soul of black wet sound. Take a deep breath and blow the bridge down.